The crowd outside the Fresh Mart supermarket stood frozen, like statues. A glossy black Bentley had just screeched to a stop right at the curb, standing out in an almost surreal way amid the dusty parking lot of a suburban Boston shopping plaza. This was Dorchester, a neighborhood where luxury cars like this rarely ever appeared. No one had any idea what was about to happen. The car door opened. A woman stepped out, tall, radiant, power emanating from every stride she took. She wore an elegant cream-colored jumpsuit. Her red-soled Louboutin heels struck the asphalt with sharp, deliberate clicks. Her glossy brown hair was neatly tied up. Diamond earrings shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. A Cartier watch caught the light, flashing so brightly that several people had to raise their hands to shield their eyes. It was Margaret Ellington. In Boston, everyone knew her. In fact, all of America did. The tech billionaire, founder of Viridian Labs, cover star of Forbes, Fortune, and Wired, one of the most powerful women in the United States. The woman every mother wished her daughter would become. The woman business leaders dreamed of having even 5 minutes of conversation with. But today, Margaret wasn't here for a meeting. Not for an interview. Not to buy a bottle of premium wine. She was walking straight toward a janitor. He stood beside a row of shopping carts, a broom in his hands, sweeping dry leaves scattered across the sidewalk. His dark blue uniform was faded and wrinkled from being washed too many times. His black hair was tangled, as if it hadn't been combed in days. Stubble covered his chin, not long enough to be called a beard, not short enough to look neat. His eyes were sunken, fixed on the ground as though he were trying to avoid the entire world. He looked up when he heard the sound of heels approaching. Confused, startled. No one ever came up to him voluntarily, certainly not a woman from an entirely different world like this. Margaret stopped in front of him, less than a meter away. She smiled, softly, warmly, and with a sincerity that felt almost unreal. "My name is Margaret," she said. The man blinked several times, as if he needed to confirm this wasn't a hallucination. "Rowan," he replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Rowan Becker." Then, before anyone had time to breathe, she said something no one could have imagined. "I've been watching you," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "For the past 3 weeks, I've come here almost every day. I've seen how you talk to customers, not out of obligation, but because you genuinely listen to them. I've seen how you explained change to that little kid, patiently, clearly, like a real teacher. I've heard you discussing data, business, optimization algorithms with the warehouse manager, as if you'd lived in that world your entire life." Her heart was pounding so fast she could hear it herself. "I don't know who you are, where you come from, or what brought you here, but I believe, truly believe, that you don't belong in this place. You just need a second chance." Rowan stood still. No one had ever spoken to him like this. No one had ever seen anything in him beyond a lost janitor. "So," she took a breath, "I want to ask you the craziest question of my life." She looked straight into his eyes. "Will you marry me?" The street seemed to stop breathing. An elderly woman pushing a cart froze mid-step. 2 teenagers nearly dropped their Slurpees. A man in his car rolled down the window, unable to believe what he was seeing. Inside the supermarket, employees behind the glass stared with eyes wide as saucers. Rowan's mouth fell open. This had to be a joke, a prank, hidden cameras, some outrageous challenge by bored rich people. There was no way a woman like her would propose to a worn-out janitor like him. A bitter smile crossed his face. "If you're really serious," he said, "go inside, buy a ring, come back out, kneel down, and ask me again, as if you truly mean it." The crowd erupted in whispers. "Is he crazy? Who turns down a billionaire?" But Margaret didn't waver. She wasn't offended. She wasn't embarrassed. "All right," she said. Then she turned around and walked straight into the supermarket. 5 minutes later, she came back out. In her hand was a black velvet box. She opened it. Inside was the most expensive diamond ring the supermarket carried. $47,000. The diamond wasn't enormous, but it was sharp, clear, and brilliant enough to make the entire crowd fall silent. And then, in front of dozens of people, recording, crying, laughing, live streaming, Margaret Ellington knelt down on the dusty pavement. "Rowan Becker," she said, her voice trembling but her gaze unwavering. "Will you marry me?" Rowan stood frozen, as if turned to stone. Phones were raised everywhere. Some people cried, some laughed. Traffic slowed as drivers leaned out of their windows. An elderly man clutched his chest, overwhelmed. Rowan looked down at the woman kneeling before him, the woman who had everything, yet was offering him what he had lost long ago: belief. His eyes burned. He nodded. "Yes," he whispered, "I will." The crowd erupted with emotion. Margaret slid the ring onto his hand, a hand rough with calluses and dust. He stared at it, as if it belonged to a world that was never meant to be his. She stood up and smiled. "Now, get in the car." He hesitated, glancing down at his old uniform, his worn shoes, the dirt under his nails. "I'll dirty your seat," he said quietly. "That car, it's worth more than everything I've ever owned combined." "I don't care," Margaret replied. "Leather seats can be cleaned. This moment can't." Rowan removed his dirty apron and folded it carefully, like a farewell ritual. She opened the door. He stepped into the Bentley. The smell of new leather and the cool air conditioning made him dizzy. The door closed. The car pulled away. And Rowan, the man who believed life had forgotten him, had no idea that his story was only just beginning. If you've watched this far, what do you think about this moment? And where in the world are you watching from? I truly want to know how far this story will travel. What do you think will happen when Rowan steps into Margaret's world? Subscribe to the channel to watch the next part, and join me in continuing this journey. To understand why this moment happened, we need to go back 3 weeks earlier. The wall clock in the office showed 8 p.m. Margaret Ellington was still sitting there alone, in the corner office on the 47th floor of the Viridian Labs building, looking down at Boston submerged in a sea of lights. She had just finished a 4-hour board meeting. Revenue this quarter was up 23%. The stock had reached an all-time high. A new partner from Japan had just signed a $200 million contract. On paper, everything was perfect. Yet she had never felt so empty. The room was vast, filled with expensive things. A mahogany desk imported from Italy, handcrafted leather chairs from England, abstract paintings on the walls worth millions of dollars. And yet, there was no laughter, no warmth, only the low hum of the air conditioner and the ticking of the clock. Margaret looked down at the photograph on her desk, Chloe, her daughter, grinning broadly on her 5th birthday. A pink princess dress, a castle-shaped cake, eyes glowing with happiness. That smile was the only thing still strong enough to pull her out of bed every morning. Her phone vibrated. A message from Chloe. "Mom, can you come home and have dinner with me? I miss you. I made mac and cheese, but it's a little burnt. The nanny says it's okay, but I want to eat with you." Margaret closed her eyes, tears welling up. How many dinners had she missed? How many bedtime stories? How many Sunday mornings making pancakes? How many moments that no amount of money could ever buy back? She thought of her parents, Robert and Eleanor Ellington. Her father was a literature professor at Boston University, her mother a pianist. They weren't wealthy, but their small house in Brookline was always filled with laughter and music. Every evening, her father read Shakespeare to Margaret, while her mother softly played the piano in the background. They taught her that success wasn't measured by money, but by the people you love. They died in a car accident when she was 25, just as Viridian Labs began turning a profit. A rainy night in November. A truck lost control on Interstate Y-90. Her parents were on their way home after a concert celebrating their 30th wedding anniversary. She didn't get to say goodbye. She didn't get to say, "I love you," one more time. That night, she had snapped at her mother on the phone because she reminded Margaret not to work too late. "I know, Mom. I'm busy. I'll call you tomorrow." Those were the last words she ever said to her mother. The call from the hospital came at 3 in the morning, and her world collapsed. For months afterward, she couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't do anything except sit in the dark, asking herself why she hadn't said "I love you" one more time. Then there was Daniel, her husband. They met at Harvard, at a conference on artificial intelligence. He was a doctoral researcher in architecture. She was an MBA student. He was tall, handsome, with a smile that made her forget everything else. They fell madly in love, the kind of love she thought existed only in novels. Their wedding took place in a small church in Cape Cod, with only about 50 guests. Daniel cried while reading his vows. Margaret believed they would walk through life together until the very end. When Chloe was born, they became one of the happiest families in Boston. Daniel quit his job to stay home with their daughter, while Margaret continued building Viridian. They made plans: a house in the suburbs, 2 more children, summer vacations in Europe. Then, one morning, Daniel disappeared. Margaret remembered it vividly. Tuesday, March 15th. She woke up at 6 a.m. as usual, but the other side of the bed was empty. She thought Daniel had gotten up early to feed Chloe. When she went downstairs, Chloe was sitting alone in the dining chair, crying from hunger. Daniel was nowhere in the house. The car was still in the garage. His wallet was on the table. His phone was still charging on the nightstand. But Daniel, the flesh and blood man, was gone. No explanation, no message, no warning signs. The police searched for months. The FBI got involved, suspecting criminal elements. Private investigators were hired at a cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars. But there were no traces, no body, no evidence of kidnapping, accident, or suicide. Daniel, 32 years old, had simply vanished from the world. Chloe was only 2 at the time. She kept asking again and again, "Where's Daddy, Mom? Where did Daddy go?" Margaret didn't know how to answer. She could only hold her daughter and cry. For years, she waited. She kept the old phone number, the old email address, the old house, in case Daniel came back and needed to find them. Every night, she prayed. She hoped that one day the door would open and Daniel would walk in with some reasonable explanation. Maybe he had lost his memory. Maybe he had been kidnapped and escaped. Maybe there was some story she hadn't yet imagined. But that day never came, and she was forced to keep living. She poured everything into her work. Under her leadership, Viridian Labs grew rapidly. But every night, returning to the large, empty mansion, she felt less like a human being and more like a machine designed to generate money and profit. Chloe needed a father. She needed a companion. But her heart had frozen on the day Daniel disappeared. A week after that night in the office, Margaret was driving home after an exhausting day when she realized she needed to stop at a supermarket. The refrigerator was almost empty. She had forgotten to shop for an entire week. Normally she ordered online, or had the nanny handle it, but today she wanted to pick out fruit for Chloe herself. She turned into Freshmart, a modest supermarket in Dorchester that she had never visited before. This wasn't an area she usually frequented. No Whole Foods, no Trader Joe's, just a local store with a pothole-filled parking lot and faded signage. While she was choosing apples in the produce section, she heard a voice behind her. "No, you calculated it wrong. If you have $10 and buy 3 items at $2.50 each, you'll have $2.50 left, not $3.50. Let me explain again. $2.50 times 3 is $7.50. 10 minus $7.50 leaves $2.50. See? She turned around. A janitor was squatting beside a boy of about 8, patiently explaining the math. The boy seemed to be a customer's child, holding a $10 bill and a few small toys, trying to figure out if he had enough money. The janitor's uniform was wrinkled and faded. His hair was messy, his beard uneven. But the way he spoke, clear, logical, patient, made Margaret stop short. This wasn't the way someone who only swept floors talked. It was the voice of a teacher, of someone accustomed to analyzing and explaining. "Oh, I get it now," the boy exclaimed. "Thank you." The janitor smiled, a rare, fleeting smile, as if he had forgotten how to smile and was relearning it. "You're welcome. Just remember, math isn't hard. You just need to remember the rules and practice." Margaret stood at the end of the aisle, a bag of apples in her arms, silently watching, forgetting entirely what she had been doing. She returned to Fresh Mart the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. At first, she told herself it was just convenient. Then, she told herself the fridge was empty again. Eventually, she stopped telling herself anything. She simply went. Every time, she saw the same man. He swept, gathered carts, mopped floors, took out the trash. Mundane, repetitive, dull work. But occasionally, she caught him talking to someone, and every time, she was more surprised. Once, she saw him help an elderly woman find medication. The woman needed a pain reliever, but couldn't remember the name. He patiently asked about her symptoms, asked what she had used before, then led her to the correct shelf. "Low-dose aspirin would be better if you have heart issues," he said, "but you should ask your doctor before using it regularly." Another time, she saw him speaking with a young employee struggling with the inventory management software. "This system uses the FIFO algorithm, first in, first out," he explained. "If you want to optimize it, you need to track inventory by batch numbers, not product codes. That will reduce losses from expired goods." Yet another time, she overheard him discussing shopping habits with the store manager. Frozen food sales increase about 15% in winter, but drop around 20% in summer. If you adjust display space seasonally, revenue could increase by at least 10%. Data from large chains consistently shows that. The manager looked at him as if he had just spoken a foreign language. Process optimization, customer data analysis, FIFO algorithms, seasonal consumption trends. These were concepts familiar only to industry insiders. Even Margaret, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech company, had needed years of work to truly internalize them. Who is he? Margaret wondered every night as she lay awake, unable to sleep. Why was someone who spoke like this sweeping floors in a suburban supermarket? She began to investigate. Carefully, discreetly. She didn't want to invade his privacy, but she had the resources to learn the basics. His name was Rowan Becker, 42 years old, had worked at Fresh Mart for 3 years, lived alone in a small nearby apartment. No criminal record, no debts, no listed family contacts, as if 3 years ago he had stepped out of nothingness. But when Margaret dug deeper, and with a billionaire's resources that wasn't difficult, she found a name. Familiar, yet strange. Also Rowan Becker, but a PhD in data science from MIT. Rowan Becker, former director of analytics at a top consulting firm. Rowan Becker, once invited to speak at TED on the future of big data. Then that name disappeared. 5 years ago, all traces stopped. No more articles, no more conferences, no more public appearances. As if he had died. But he hadn't died. He was sweeping floors in a suburban Boston supermarket. What had happened between these two versions of the same name? Margaret couldn't find the answer, but she found something else, a strange belief. She believed this man didn't belong here. She believed something had pushed him off the cliff of his life, leaving him clinging to the edge with barely enough strength to hold on. He needed a hand to pull him up, and she wanted to be that hand. One night, Lying in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, a crazy thought suddenly occurred to her. If she offered him a job, he would almost certainly refuse. He would think she pitied him, that she was simply a wealthy benefactor. He would retreat, closing off his heart. But what if she did something big enough to prove she was truly serious? She shook her head. Crazy. Completely crazy. But the thought wouldn't leave her. It followed her into sleep, followed her to the office, followed her through every meal. It whispered every time she saw Chloe smile, a smile missing the presence of a father. She didn't love Rowan Becker. She barely knew him. But between them was an unnamed resonance. Two people broken in different ways, still trying to live on even when their hearts no longer had a reason. 3 weeks later, she made her decision. She wouldn't just offer him a job. She would do something he couldn't refuse. Something that proved she was truly betting on him, not out of pity, but because she saw his real worth. She would propose to him. And that insane decision led to the moment outside the Fresh Mart supermarket, where a billionaire knelt before a janitor, opening the story you saw at the beginning of this tale. Back to the present. The Bentley glided smoothly through the streets of Boston, heading toward the upscale Back Bay district. Rowan sat rigid in the passenger seat, clutching an old canvas bag tightly on his lap, his eyes constantly darting back and forth between Margaret and the road ahead. He didn't say anything. Neither did Margaret. There was only soft jazz from the sound system and the almost silent hum of the electric engine. Everything felt like a dream. A strange dream, absurd, illogical, impossible to be real. That morning, he had still been invisible, just a shadow in a faded uniform, sweeping trash outside the supermarket, trying not to think about anything. And now, he was the fiancé of the most admired woman in America, and he couldn't even understand why. What does she want from me, he wondered. Is she crazy, or am I crazy? Or are we both crazy? Margaret glanced at him. His eyes were bloodshot, not from emotion, not yet, but from years of breathing dust, of sleepless nights, exhaustion, and the slow destruction of merely existing, rather than truly living. There were so many things she wanted to ask. Who he was, what had happened, why he was here. But she knew it wasn't time. He needed time. He needed space. He needed to be treated like a human being before he could open his mouth and tell the story of his life. First, he needed to become a person again. "We'll stop somewhere first," she said gently. Rowan only nodded, asking nothing. The car stopped in front of a high-end barber shop on Newbury Street, the most luxurious shopping street in Boston. The sign read, "The Gentleman's Quarter, Grooming and Spa." The clear glass door revealed a gleaming marble floor inside, gold-trimmed mirrors, a polished mahogany counter, and luxurious black leather chairs. A man wearing a white shirt and a gray vest stepped out to open the door, a professional smile on his lips. That smile faltered slightly when he saw Rowan, dirty uniform, messy hair, patchy beard, but immediately returned to perfection when he saw Margaret step out of the Bentley. "Ms. Ellington!" he exclaimed, his voice full of respect. "We are honored to serve you." Margaret walked in, Rowan following behind. "He's with me," she said. "I want the best service for him. Everything. Haircut, shave, skincare, all of it." The man only nodded. "Of course, ma'am." In the world of people like Margaret Ellington, there were no questions, only obedience. Margaret turned to Rowan and smiled. "Let them take care of you. I'll wait outside." Rowan wanted to say something, perhaps, "It's not necessary," or "I don't deserve it." But Margaret had already turned away, stepping outside before he could open his mouth. For the next hour and a half, Rowan sat motionless in the black leather chair, closing his eyes and letting unfamiliar hands work on his body. They cut his hair, long tangled strands falling to the floor, lock by lock. They washed his hair, warm water and herbal shampoo sinking into his scalp. rinsing away years of dust. They shaved him, each gentle stroke of the razor gliding over his cheeks, his chin, his neck, peeling away the shell he had built over so many years. And as the razor passed over his skin, memories rushed in. Anna, his wife. She had once sat on the bed watching him shave every morning, teasing him, "I like you better with a beard. You look more masculine." From that day on, he grew one, and after she died, he never shaved again, as if the beard were the last thread tying him to her. Now it was falling to the floor, strand by strand, strand by strand, as if he were erasing the last remaining part of his old self. Tears suddenly spilled out, mixing into the shaving foam. The barber startled, stopping his hand, worried. "Sir, are you okay? Did I hurt you?" Rowan drew a deep breath, his chest trembling slightly. "I'm fine," he answered, his voice thick and hoarse. "Keep going." The barber hesitated for a moment, then continued. When they finished, they handed him a mirror. Rowan looked into it, and he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. A sharp jawline emerged beneath freshly shaved skin, high cheekbones, slightly thinner than he remembered, but still carrying a strong structure. His black hair was cut short and styled to the side, revealing a thoughtful forehead. His eyes, those eyes he had avoided looking at for years, were still tired, still heavy with sorrow. But there was something new in them. A spark, a sliver of hope, a hint of life. "Is that me?" he wondered, raising a hand to touch his face. "Or the shadow of who I used to be?" "Sir, your clothes are here." An employee approached, holding a new outfit, a tailored white dress shirt, fitted black trousers, polished cognac leather shoes. Margaret had arranged it in advance, guessing his size correctly. Rowan hesitated for a brief moment. The last time he had worn clothes like this was at a funeral. 5 coffins. 5 of the people he loved most. And he had stood there in a black suit, unable to cry because he had run out of tears, unable to speak because his throat was locked tight, unable to do anything but stand still, like a corpse among corpses. He took a deep breath, pushed the memory aside, and stepped into the changing room. When he came out, Margaret rose from the chair where she had been waiting. Her eyes widened, her lips parting slightly. Where only a few hours earlier there had been a shabby, dirty, invisible janitor, now stood a completely different man. A man she had only glimpsed through the way he spoke about data and people in the supermarket. A man who carried intelligence, quietness, and a kind of hidden power. The power of someone who had once stood very high and knew he could return there. "This is the man I saw," she murmured, as if confirming it. Rowan stood there, not knowing what to do with his hands, looking like a teenager going to prom for the first time. "I feel like," he hesitated, "like I've come back to life, like I've just stepped out of a grave." "You haven't seen anything yet," Margaret replied, taking his hand. "Come on." They returned to the car and continued driving home. When the Bentley stopped in front of the mansion gates, Rowan's eyes widened. "This is your house?" "No," Margaret smiled. "This is our house now." The iron gates opened slowly, revealing a huge white mansion with a wide glass facade, 2 rows of tall maple trees lined up along the driveway. In the middle of the courtyard, a fountain welcomed them with white sprays of water. Rowan stepped out of the car slowly, like a child walking into a fairyland. Inside, the house carried a faint scent of vanilla and lavender. From the high ceiling, crystal chandeliers cast warm light. On the grand staircase, a curly-haired little girl, eyes still heavy with sleep, stood rubbing her eyes. She wore pajamas printed with Princess Elsa. "Mom, who is that?" she asked. Margaret opened her arms. "Chloe, come down and say hello, sweetheart." The girl ran down, hugging her mother tightly. Then she looked up at Rowan, her gaze curious and cautious. "This is Mom's friend," Margaret introduced. "His name is Rowan." and he'll be staying with us from now on." Chloe tilted her head and studied him closely for a long moment. "Are you a good person?" Rowan lowered himself, bending one knee so he was at her eye level. "I'm trying," he answered honestly. Chloe looked at him for a few more seconds, then nodded firmly. "Then you can stay. But you're not allowed to tell ghost stories at night, okay?" Rowan let out a soft laugh, the first real laugh in many long years. "I promise." That night, Margaret arranged a guest room for Rowan on the second floor. Martha, the housekeeper, brought up a tray of food: roast beef, mashed potatoes, steamed vegetables. Rowan ate slowly, savoring each bite. How many years had it been since he'd eaten a meal like this? Afterward, he stepped out onto the balcony and sat watching the lights of Boston glitter in the distance. The city looked like a sky full of stars turned upside down. Margaret came over carrying 2 glasses of wine. She sat beside him and handed him one. "Now," she said, her eyes still on the horizon, "tell me, who are you? Rowan Becker?" He stared at his hands for a long time, the calluses, the scars, the traces of a life she didn't yet know. "That's a long story," he said softly. "I have all night," Margaret replied. Rowan drew a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into the depths of memory, and then he began. "My name is Rowan Becker, and you're right, I wasn't always just a janitor." His voice was low and rough, as if every word carried the weight of an entire decade of pain. "I earned my PhD in data science from MIT when I was 27. I worked with international companies. Google, Microsoft, Goldman Sachs were all clients of mine. I trained analysts, built predictive models for banks and hospitals. I was invited to speak at MIT at Stanford. I had a TED talk with over 2 million views." Margaret remained silent, simply listening. "I had a wife, Anna Marie Sullivan. We met at a tech conference in San Francisco. She was a software engineer, brilliant beyond words. But what made me fall in love with her was her smile. That smile could make me forget everything in the world." His gaze drifted somewhere far away. "We had 2 children. Lucy, she was her mother's mirror image, and by the age of 8, she had already read the entire Harry Potter series. And Jonah, 5 years old, impossibly mischievous, but all it took was one smile and the whole family melted." His voice began to tremble. "My parents lived with us. My father had been a mathematics professor at Boston University. My mother was a nurse. They retired early to be close to their grandchildren. The house in Newton was always noisy. Children's laughter, my mother singing in the kitchen, my father flipping through the newspaper, Anna calling me downstairs for dinner." He stopped and closed his eyes. "That was a perfect life. I had everything a man could ever dream of." Silence stretched for a long moment, until one day in December. Rowan swallowed hard, his shoulders trembling slightly. "We planned a winter vacation in Colorado. Aspen, the whole family. Anna, Lucy, Jonah, my parents. Lucy was excited about skiing. Jonah kept asking, 'Dad, are there snowmen there?' He drew a deep breath, his breathing uneven. "That morning I had an important meeting. A major client from Washington, D.C. had flown to Boston. The meeting couldn't be postponed. I told Anna I would fly out to join them the next day." He opened his eyes, staring into the empty space ahead. "That morning, I remember every detail. It was cold, a thin layer of snow still left over from the night before. I was in a hurry. The meeting started at 9. Anna was feeding the kids breakfast in the kitchen. Jonah spilled his milk and burst into tears. Lucy was arguing with her grandmother about how many books she was allowed to bring. He let out a soft, broken laugh. A perfectly ordinary, chaotic morning. I had no idea it would be the last time I ever saw it. Anna walked to the door with her bag over her shoulder. She was wearing the red coat I had given her for her birthday the year before. She turned back and said, Rowan's voice suddenly cracked. Promise me. Don't let work make you forget the trip. I was staring at emails on my phone. I only looked up for a second, said, I promise, and kissed her absent-mindedly, just a light touch on her cheek. I didn't even look her in the eyes. Tears rolled down his face. I didn't hug the kids. I didn't kiss them goodbye. Lucy ran to the door. Bye, Dad. And I just waved. Jonah was in my mother's arms, still sniffling about the spilled milk. I didn't step closer to him. The taxi arrived. I stood at the door, waving as they left. Anna, Lucy, Jonah, my parents, the 5 people I loved most in the world, got into the car and headed for the airport. That was the last time I ever saw them. Margaret raised a hand to cover her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. The plane took off at 9 a.m. from Logan Airport, Rowan continued. United Airlines, Flight 1892 to Denver. At 9:47, while the plane was at 35,000 feet over Pennsylvania airspace, a technical failure occurred. The aircraft lost control and crashed into the Allegheny Mountains. He stopped. There were no survivors. 157 passengers and crew. 5 of them were mine. The air felt heavy enough to touch. I found out from the television. I was sitting in a conference room preparing to present. Someone turned on the breaking news about the crash. I looked up and saw the flight number, United 1892. The rest? I don't remember clearly. People told me I screamed, smashed my laptop, collapsed onto the floor. My colleagues had to call an ambulance. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. Mr. Becker, the doctor said, we're very sorry. That was when I knew it wasn't a nightmare. The days that followed were hell, Rowan continued, his voice dropping lower. I had to go to the morgue to identify the bodies. 5 people. The 5 people I loved most. He closed his eyes. They weren't intact anymore, Margaret. The plane fell from 35,000 feet. I had to identify them by what was left. Anna's wedding ring, the bracelet Lucy had strung herself from pink plastic beads, Jonah's teddy bear, my father's watch. Margaret sobbed aloud. The funeral was held on a rainy day. 5 coffins lined up in the church. 5 sealed coffins. And I stood there alone, unable to cry anymore because I had already run out of tears. After the funeral, I couldn't live in that house for even one more day. Everything reminded me of them. My father's chair, the corner of the kitchen where my mother cooked porridge, Lucy's room filled with stuffed animals, Jonah's room full of toy cars. I started drinking. 1 glass, then 2, then an entire bottle. Whiskey was the only thing that let me sleep without dreaming about them. Then I stopped going to work. The company called. I didn't answer. Friends came knocking. I didn't open the door. I just wanted to disappear from the world. A year later, I lost my job. 6 months after that, I lost the house because I couldn't pay anymore. I sold everything. I kept exactly one thing. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn box. He opened it. Inside was a family photograph. Anna, Lucy, Jonah, his parents, and him, all smiling brightly. This is the only thing I have left. Margaret stared at the photograph, tears flowing freely. I wandered for a while, slept in my car, and when I no longer had the car, I slept in parks. Then one day, I saw the hiring sign at Fresh Mart. They needed a cleaner. They didn't ask about the past. They just needed someone willing to work. He gave a small shrug. And I just needed a place to exist. Not to live. Just to exist. For the past 3 years, I've swept floors, lined up carts, cleaned toilets. I kept conversations with anyone to a minimum. I just counted the days passing and wondered when it would all finally end. Rowan lifted his head and looked straight into Margaret's eyes. Then you appeared and asked me if I wanted to marry you. Margaret wiped her tears, her voice breaking. I understand that pain, Rowan. I lost my parents in an accident too, and my husband disappeared when Chloe was only 2 years old, without a single explanation. I waited for years, but he never came back. Rowan looked at her, stunned. You built all of this? After all that? She nodded. I had to live, for Chloe, and for myself. Rowan lowered his head. You're a true warrior. Margaret smiled through her tears. So are you. You just haven't realized it yet. They sat in silence together for a long time. The distant sounds of the city, the wind moving across the balcony, the steady beating of two hearts that had once believed their lives were already over. Rowan took a deep breath. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't just feel like he was alive. He began to feel that he wanted to keep living. The next morning, Rowan woke to the sound of birds singing outside the window, warm sunlight slipping through the sheer curtains, and the rich aroma of coffee drifting up from downstairs. For a few seconds, he simply lay there, listening to everything. This feeling of peace. How long had it been since he had last touched it? Then Rowan suddenly sat up, half believing, half doubting that everything from the night before had been nothing more than a dream. Too beautiful to be real. But no, the room was still there. The soft blanket, the comfortable bed, the gentle warmth in the air. Everything was real. A soft knock sounded at the door. Come in, he replied. Chloe peeked her head inside, her curly hair messy, still wearing her soft pajamas. Good morning, Rowan. Mom told me to come get you for breakfast. There are pancakes. Rowan laughed at her enthusiasm. Good morning, Chloe. I'll be right down. She immediately disappeared, the thudding sound of her footsteps racing down the stairs echoing like an announcement of a new, energetic day. Margaret was already seated at the dining table, dressed in an elegant navy blue suit, sunlight falling across her face, making her look both strong and warm. Good morning, she said. Good morning, Rowan replied, taking a seat across from her. On the table was a generous breakfast, golden pancakes, sunny side-up eggs, crispy bacon, and a pitcher of fresh, cold orange juice. Eat, Margaret said. You'll need the energy. Rowan frowned. Why? Margaret looked at him, her gaze serious yet gentle. Because today you start working. Rowan nearly choked. Working? Where? Viridian Labs, she replied lightly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I didn't propose to you out of pity, Rowan. My company truly needs someone like you. He shook his head, his voice lowering. Margaret, I've been out of the industry for 5 years. Technology changes every day. Then you'll relearn, Margaret said without hesitation. What you were capable of hasn't disappeared. The core skills are still there. You just need someone to believe in you. Rowan looked down at his plate, his hands trembling slightly. I don't know if I'm ready. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand, her voice warm and steady. I know. And I believe in you. That's enough. That afternoon, Rowan followed Margaret into the 50-story glass tower, the headquarters of Viridian Labs. Inside, it felt like a different world. Light reflecting off glass, chrome gleaming, confidence present in every step the employees took. Everyone was busy. Everyone had a clear objective in mind. And then, all eyes began to turn toward Rowan. Who is that? I've never seen him before. Is he her new partner? Rowan walked past the murmurs, feeling only the cold creeping into his hands. They went up to the executive floor. Margaret opened the door to a corner office, spacious, bright, with a panoramic view of Boston. On the desk lay an elegant card. Welcome, Mr. Rowan Becker, Director of Strategic Data Analytics. Rowan froze. This is for me? Margaret nodded. As of today, you are Viridian's Director of Data Analytics. You report directly to me. Rowan still couldn't believe it. But my resume, it's completely blank. Who needs a resume? Margaret smiled lightly. I'm the CEO. I have the authority to hire anyone I want. But not everyone at Viridian welcomed his arrival. At the first leadership meeting, David Morrison, the chief financial officer, was the first to speak. "Excuse me, Ms. Ellington," he said, his voice filled with skepticism, "but who exactly is Mr. Becker? I can't find any professional record of him over the past 5 years." The room fell silent instantly. All eyes turned to Rowan. He took a deep breath. "For the past 5 years, I've been a janitor at a suburban Boston supermarket." A wave of whispers spread across the room. "A janitor?" David repeated, the word almost dripping with undisguised contempt. "Before that," Rowan continued, his voice strangely calm, "I earned a Ph.D. from MIT. I consulted for Google, Microsoft, and Goldman Sachs." The room went quiet. "5 years ago," he went on, "I lost my wife, my 2 children, and my parents in a plane crash. I lost everything, and I no longer wanted to live." There were no whispers now. Only a heavy, suffocating silence. "Ms. Ellington gave me a second chance," Rowan concluded, "and I will do everything to prove she wasn't wrong." The first weeks sounded glamorous, but the reality was hell. Technology had changed too much. Python, TensorFlow, PyTorch, things that had still been in their infancy 5 years earlier, were now standard. Rowan felt like someone who had stepped into the future without a map. He sat in front of his screen 12 hours a day, reading documentation, watching tutorials, filling pages with notes. There were moments when he wanted to close the laptop, walk out of the room, and disappear. "I don't belong here. I'm just an imposter." But then he remembered the moment Margaret knelt on the sidewalk that day, her eyes filled with faith in a man who had lost himself. He couldn't betray that trust. Rowan kept going. He arrived the earliest, left the latest, and slowly the sharp analytical instincts he once had began to return. Not gone, just buried in silence for too long. 1 month later, at a board meeting, Rowan stood before a large screen. "I've analyzed all operational data from the past 3 years," he began, "and I found a pattern no one noticed." He clicked a button. Charts appeared. "Our cloud resource allocation system is extremely wasteful. We're paying for 40% of capacity that is never used. If we implement the optimization algorithm I'm proposing, Viridian can save approximately $18 million per year." The room fell into the kind of silence Rowan knew was a good sign. David Morrison slowly asked, "That figure, where did you get it from?" Rowan presented dozens of charts, predictive models, calculation formulas. Every data point was clear and solid. Richard Chen, the chairman of the board, looked at him with rare approval. "Impressive, Mr. Becker." When the meeting ended, David Morrison approached him, his expression noticeably softer. "It seems I underestimated you," he said. "I apologize." Rowan simply smiled. "That's all right. I once underestimated myself too." From that day on, Rowan no longer merely existed. He began to live again, and then to grow. He attended technology conferences. He led the analytics team. He published an article in Harvard Business Review titled "Second Chance Leadership." The eyes that had once been sunken and lifeless now shimmered with vitality, as if a small flame were slowly reigniting inside him. And Margaret, she too, changed in ways she had never expected. She smiled more, came home earlier, spent time playing with Chloe instead of burying herself in work. In the evenings, the 3 of them sat down for dinner together. Chloe talked about school. Margaret talked about the company. And Rowan listened, occasionally offering a comment that made both mother and daughter burst into laughter. But Chloe did not easily accept his presence. One night, when Rowan tried to sit down to read her a story, Chloe shook her head immediately. "I don't want you to read. I want Mom." "Chloe," Margaret began to say, but Rowan gently raised his hand. "It's okay," he said softly. "Your mom will read to you." He stepped out into the hallway, and just as the bedroom door closed, he heard Chloe whisper, quiet but loud enough to tighten his heart. "Mom, is he my new dad? I don't want a new dad. I want my old dad to come back." Rowan stood there for a long time, one hand pressed to his chest, feeling as though someone were crushing his heart. A week later, Chloe stayed curled up in her room, refusing to come down for dinner. Rowan knocked gently. "May I come in?" Silence. Then a small, hesitant, "Okay." He stepped inside and sat down on the edge of the bed. Chloe hugged her pillow tightly, avoiding his gaze. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Nothing." "Chloe," Rowan said, his voice softening, "I know something is making you sad." The silence stretched. Then suddenly, the little girl burst into tears. "Why did my dad leave me? Why didn't he love me enough to stay?" Rowan froze. This was the first time Chloe had spoken about her biological father. "I don't know why your father made that choice," he said slowly, weighing every word. "I can't speak for him. But I do know one thing. The fact that he left was never your fault." Chloe cried even harder. "But I miss him so much. I miss him terribly." Rowan reached out and pulled her into his arms. "I understand," he said. "I miss the people I love too. I miss them so much, it hurts in my chest." He gently placed a hand over her heart. "But do you know something? They're still here, right here, in our hearts." Chloe clung to him, crying into his shoulder. They sat that way for a long time, with only her sobs and her trembling breaths filling the room. Finally, Chloe lifted her head. "Uncle Rowan?" "Yes, sweetheart?" Can I call you Dad?" Rowan choked up, his voice trembling. "If you want to, that would make me very happy." A small smile appeared on Chloe's face, the first smile she'd had all day. Then, "Dad, I'm hungry." Rowan laughed, tears streaming down his face. "Then let's go eat, my daughter." From that day on, Chloe called Rowan Dad. And Rowan, the man who believed he would never hear that word again, finally reclaimed a part of his soul he had thought was lost forever. He was no longer just someone Margaret had rescued. He had become part of a family, part of warmth, part of hope. One late autumn night, with golden leaves carpeting the walkway, Rowan and Margaret sat together on the balcony. Rowan looked at her, his voice low and sincere. "Why did you do it? That day, at the supermarket?" Margaret remained silent for a long moment before speaking softly. "I don't have a perfect answer. I just felt it. When I saw you, I saw someone carrying unimaginable pain, yet still holding on to kindness. You stopped to help a child with math. You didn't judge anyone. You were patient with the whole world, except yourself." She looked straight into his eyes. "I saw someone God wasn't finished with yet." Rowan gave a sad smile. "At the time, I thought you were crazy." Margaret let out a quiet laugh. "I thought I was crazy too. But there are things. The heart knows before the mind does." Rowan leaned toward her. Margaret didn't pull away. She leaned toward him as well. Their lips met, softly, trembling, like two people learning how to love again after having lost everything. A kiss between two souls once shattered, and finally finding their way back into the light. 1 month after their first kiss, during a rooftop dinner at the mansion, the atmosphere was warm and serene, as if the whole world were breathing softly. Rowan suddenly stood up. "Margaret!" She looked up, slightly surprised. "What is it?" "There's something I want to say." The words made Chloe stop eating, her big eyes fixed on him with curiosity. Rowan slipped his hand into the pocket of his suit jacket. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, and Chloe held her breath. Then Rowan knelt down. Chloe gasped. "Oh my gosh!" In his hand was a shimmering platinum ring, the ring he had bought with his first 3 months' salary at Viridian. Rowan looked up at Margaret, his eyes trembling but filled with resolve. 7 months ago, you knelt in front of me on a dusty sidewalk, he said, his voice low and warm. You gave me a chance I never thought I deserved. You saw something in me, something I myself had stopped seeing. Margaret raised a hand to her mouth, tears beginning to well in her eyes. You gave me a new life. You gave me a reason to wake up every morning. You gave me a family. He glanced at Chloe and smiled. You and your daughter are everything I need. He took a deep breath. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of the love you gave me. Then Rowan lifted the ring, his hand slightly trembling. This time, I want to do it the right way. Margaret Ellington, will you be my wife? Tears streamed down Margaret's cheeks. Yes, she whispered, then broke down crying. 1,000 times, yes. Chloe jumped up like a tiny firework. Yay! Mom and Dad are getting married! Rowan slid the ring onto Margaret's finger, the hand that had pulled him back from the edge of despair. And on the rooftop, under the soft golden lights, the three of them held each other tightly. It was the embrace of a family reborn, the embrace of hearts that had once been shattered, now finding one another again. 2 months later, Margaret and Rowan were married in an old church in Cambridge, just a few blocks away from MIT. Unlike the lavish weddings people often imagine for a female billionaire, their ceremony was simple and intimate. Only 80 guests, family and true friends, exactly as Margaret wished. She didn't need a grand stage. She only needed a moment that was real. As Rowan stood at the end of the aisle, watching Margaret walk in wearing an elegant white wedding dress, her hand holding Chloe's as the little flower girl, his heart felt as though it might burst with happiness. This was something he had once believed he would never have again. I, Rowan Becker, he read his vows, his voice low but steady, take you, Margaret Ellington, to be my wife, in sickness and in health, in wealth or in poverty, until death parts us. Then he looked into her eyes and added softly, and beyond that, I promise to always remember that you saw me at a time when I could no longer see myself. When they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the church filled with applause, warm, heartfelt, and full of blessing. 1 week after the wedding, as breakfast came to an end, Rowan turned to Margaret. I want to visit them. He didn't need to explain. Margaret understood immediately. Let me go with you. They drove to Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, a historic cemetery with winding paths and maple trees turning red and gold in the autumn light. Beneath the canopy of leaves, 5 graves lay side by side, silent and solemn. Rowan knelt down and placed 5 bouquets of fresh flowers on the headstones. Anna, Lucy, Jonah, Dad, Mom. I'm sorry it took me so long to come back. Tears fell onto the cold stone. I once believed I didn't deserve to keep living. I once thought happiness was a betrayal of those who were gone. But then I met someone who gave me a second chance. He laid his trembling hand on Anna's grave. You will always be my first love. Our children will always be my angels. But now, I want to live. I want to live for them, too. Margaret stood behind him, tears streaming down her face, her hand resting gently on her husband's shoulder. As they returned to the car, the maple trees still whispered in the autumn wind, their red leaves glowing like small flames. Rowan walked slowly toward the passenger seat and drew a deep breath. For the first time in many years, his chest no longer felt heavy, as if the stone that had pressed on his heart for so long had finally been lifted. He took Margaret's hand. She smiled. And in that moment, amid the quiet cemetery and the autumn colors of Cambridge, his life truly began again. 3 years have passed since the day Margaret knelt on the sidewalk in front of Freshmart. The moment that overturned Rowan's entire life. Now, Rowan is the co-CEO of Viridian Labs. Not because he is Margaret's husband, but because he has proven his capabilities through dozens of major projects, breakthrough innovations, and a level of leadership the board had never initially seen in him. Chloe, now 8 years old, calls Rowan Dad, as naturally as if there had never been a void there at all. Together, they've built small rituals just for the two of them. Reading before bedtime every night, making pancakes on Sunday mornings, and watching the Red Sox every summer. Just like a family that has been close for a very long time. And then, something new appeared. Margaret became pregnant. When the pregnancy test came back positive, she sat down on the bed and cried for an entire hour. Not out of fear, but because pure happiness surged through her chest. Rowan cried too. He had never thought he would have another child. Never thought he deserved another chance to be a father. The night before Margaret gave birth, Rowan barely slept. He stood by the bedroom window, looking out at the misty Boston night sky, city lights glowing like stars scattered across the ground. And memories came rushing back. Anna, Lucy, Jonah. Those faces, those voices, those smiles returned to him like a slow-motion film. Tears fell uncontrollably. For the first time in many years, he didn't try to swallow the pain down anymore. He let it flow. He allowed himself to truly cry. "Anna," he whispered into the darkness, "have you forgiven me? Are you happy to see that I've found happiness again?" There was no answer. Only the soft Boston wind moving through the trees outside the balcony. But deep within him, a sense of peace spread. As if somewhere, Anna was smiling and nodding at him. Their son was born on an early spring morning, when cherry blossoms were blooming all across Boston like bursts of pink against the blue sky. They named the boy Wyatt Ellington Becker. When Rowan held Wyatt for the first time, his hands trembled uncontrollably. The tiny body fit perfectly in his arms, breathing as lightly as a butterfly's wings. Wyatt's eyes were tightly shut, his tiny hand gripping Rowan's finger. "Hello, my son," Rowan whispered, his voice like a prayer. "I've waited for you, for a very long time." Chloe stood nearby, her eyes shining. "Can I hold him?" Rowan nodded gently, placing Wyatt into Chloe's arms and guiding her carefully on how to support his head. "Little brother." Chloe leaned down and whispered, "I'll protect you. I promise." Rowan and Margaret looked at each other, both their eyes filled with tears. But these were tears of completeness. This was their family. Not perfect, but real. Not whole from the beginning, but pieced together with love, loss, and second chances. A family in the truest sense. If you've listened this far, perhaps your heart has traveled with Margaret and Rowan through every depth and every height. From a dusty sidewalk in front of Freshmart, to a church aisle in the heart of Cambridge, to peaceful afternoons in a garden filled with children's laughter. This is not just the craziest proposal Boston has ever seen, but a story about second chances, about wounds that seem like they will never heal, and about how sometimes all it takes is one person willing to believe in you one more time. What do you think about Margaret's choice that day? If it were you, would you have the courage to kneel before someone the entire world considers lesser, simply because you saw something in them that no one else could see anymore? Let me know how you feel in the comments. Who did you relate to most in this story? And where in the world are you watching from? If you believe that every person deserves a second chance, help this story travel a little farther. Tap like on the video, leave a small comment, and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you won't miss the next healing journey. Thank you for staying until the end of the story. See you in the next telling.